Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of another double bill. And on Monday, we've got a triple bill for you. I don't know why I do things like that, but I am. But anyway, today we're calling this part of our D-Day series, but actually it goes back to events earlier in the war. And planning for that second front began years before June the 6th, 1944. One of the key players, and also in the use of heavy bombers, was General Frank Andrews. To talk about his career is historian Kathy Wilson, whose book, Marshall's Great Captain, is, of course, in the links below. I'll bring her in now. It's morning where you are, afternoon where I'm. Good morning, Kathy. How are you today?
I'm well. Good afternoon.
So, I always ask a first-time guest how you like to define yourself. You know, strictly military history, social history, researcher, biography. What label do you like being put on you?
I would probably say a historian rather than a biographer or an author, because I like the idea of the research to get the story right from whatever your perspective is.
Brilliant answer. And we're going to bring up your PowerPoint right away, which you're in charge of. And folks, we'll kind of do questions as we go along today. Any kind of big ones we'll do at the end. But well, I've been looking at the sidebar already. People are kind of saying, Kathy, that they've heard of this guy, but they don't know much about him. And is that something that when you were doing your research was kind of coming up all the time? Yeah, I know that name, but I don't know much about him.
That is probably the single biggest reason I decided to write his biography. You know, he was probably one of the most important airmen of his generation. And a lot of people know what used to be called Andrews Air Force Base and now is Joint Base Andrews as, oh, that's the base the president flies in and out of. But nobody knew who he was or what he was or why the base was named after him. They just knew a name.
Brilliant stuff. And, you know, we have these names that we talk about that everybody knows, your Eisenhowers, your MacArthurs, your Pattons, but for an event that we'll talk about that happened 81 years ago today, which you reminded me a couple of minutes ago, his name might be up there in the ones everybody has on the tip of their tongue. But I'll hand it over to you to kind of take us through this story. And as I said in the top of the show there, it includes air power, it includes the second front. It's one of those men with fingers in more than one pie, shall we say.
Certainly. So, and you're right. You know, he probably would have been spoken about more had he not died on this day 81 years ago. And, you know, because the war was, gearing up and kind of in full swing for certain countries, nobody wanted to talk about him. You had to have your heroes, especially in the U.S. You had Eisenhower and Patton and MacArthur and Jimmy Doolittle and, Ira Aker and Carl Spaatz. But he died. And he died before, things really got hot and heavy in Europe. And then, Eisenhower becomes president and, Andy is kind of written off into Never Never Land. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee, went to a prep school, played football, did the All-American stuff, went on to West Point, typical classmates of that era, Wainwright and Oscar Westover and, a couple of them, like he never fought in World War I, like Hap Arnold, but it didn't affect his outlook, right? He ended up serving over in the, as the air officer in the Army of Occupation in Germany under the man that at the time was his father-in-law. But he started out in the cavalry. Another reason that maybe people don't think about him, his first 11 years was in the cavalry, and he kind of kept that mindset. Where, mobility and maneuverability, things that were lost, at the end of World War I, and how do we bring that back into, future wars? And that's kind of how he started his career. But he'd always wanted to fly, but he fell in love with a young lady, Johnny Allen, Josephine, and wanted to marry her. But his father-in-law said, I don't want a pilot in my family. So he stayed in the cavalry, married her, and then joined the Signal Corps to become an aviator.
And just to say, the fact that you mentioned the Signal Corps there, I would say that it's a recurring theme on World War II TV. Some of the very best commanders have a background in more than one branch, more than one type of job. I'm thinking about Leslie McNair, for example, who could do tanks and air power and different things like that. And some of the generals that are perhaps, or leaders that are kind of more focused and channeled in one area, they're the ones that then come unstuck when you get to that point of the World War II where it's all about combined arms. It's all about bringing all the assets together. And someone who can kind of juggle all those things is always going to have a head start over a one-trick pony.
True. And that's why I think he was so successful, and why, he and Marshall, became, lifelong friends and confidants. And it's because he had a great understanding of the ground forces through the cavalry, and he understood, air power. And then, if you fast forward, to 1940 in the Louisiana maneuvers, he pushed for the tanks. So, he had a good friend at West Point, Adna Chaffee Jr., son of the second chief of staff of the Army. And, he was, deeply ingrained in the cavalry, because his father's, best friend, John Wilson, was a cavalry officer. Andy's grandfather fought with Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Civil War. So they had that shared mindset about, it's not really about what weapon we use, or, it's how do we use that weapon in war. And, when we go to war, what's the best way to use whatever weapons are available? Don't get stuck on, just the horse cavalry. Why not have, tanks? And he really pushed hard for tanks. And, he and Chaffee had the symbiotic relationship. Chaffee backdoored money to fund, the experimental, the 13, original B-17s. And Andy, turned around after the Louisiana maneuvers and this kind of secret meeting they had, and pushed for an independent kind of tank corps, against the wishes of the chief of infantry and chief of cavalry.
And do you think he was a visionary? I mean, it's one of those words we kind of, we bandy about, but would that apply to him in this period? Because the interwar period is fraught with people with old school views, people with radical views, and not just in the USA, Britain, Germany, Japan, everywhere struggling with this coming out of the war, to end all wars and hoping there won't be another one. But if there is one, do we fight it the way we did the last one, or do we fight it a new way? So visionary, do you think? Oh,
certainly. When I talk, you mentioned combined arms. That was his big push. From his days, people remember Andy as in one of really two ways. Either, he was the head of the GHQ Air Force, which was kind of the initial way for the Air Force to gain some independence, or as the advocate for the B-17, the heavy bomber, the long range bomber. But he was more about combined arms. He wanted to be able to use the land forces, the air forces, not just the long range bomber, but pursuit aircraft, observation aircraft, close air support, tactical air. He pushed for paratroopers. He was into counterintelligence. So certainly I would definitely put him up there as one of the visionaries during that time frame.
Brilliant. Well, I'll hand it back to you, and don't forget you can move up and down the slides. Not many slides today, folks, but
no.
Yeah, we're learning a lot already. I'm having a great time.
So let's see what we have. So this is, we talked about the B-17. Andy, he pushed for the long range bomber because he saw it as a way. I'm going to back up for a minute. When you talk about visionaries, his influences were the likes of Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell's family and Andy's family were like best friends. Andy's wife, Johnny, was big into polo as he was, and she lent Billy Mitchell one of her horses to compete in the national show. He was involved with Julio Duhay and Hugh Trenchard, and the French and Caproni from Italy. So yeah, he had these influences from around the world on how to conduct war and how to use, one of the reasons for the push for the long range bomber was because of those ideas of being able to, attack your enemy away from your land versus ground forces being face to face. So whether it was going out after ships, from naval forces, or attacking railroads or lines of communications or supply areas in the rear. This picture shows the B-17s flying past the USS Rex, which embarrassed the Navy, and kind of gave some credibility back to the Air Corps from previous bombing tests with the Navy where, they had that conflict.
Brilliant stuff.
So this is, Andrews and Marshall. Like I said, they became lifelong friends. One of the things during Andy's career that showed how versatile he was is when Andy was head of GHQ, his push for the long-range bomber and the idea of building up air power, kind of towards the end of his tour in 1939, he gave a speech in St. Louis at the National Aeronautic Association, and he flat out called out the U.S. and called us a fifth or sixth rate air power. And between that and his push for the bomber, he got himself in a bit of hot water with the general staff of the Army. And so they exiled him to Fort Sam Houston, same place Billy Mitchell was, same office, same job. But he had already formed a friendship with Marshall when Marshall was deputy chief of staff, and took him on a 9-day tour of air facilities and factories so that Marshall could have an understanding of, what the airmen were facing at the time. And, because of that, when Marshall became chief of staff and he needed a G3, the person he tapped was Andrews. So Andrews only lasted in banishment 4 months. And, the rest of the staffs were like, no, you can't have him. He's like, well, then I'm not your man for the job. I'm going to get him or else. And he got him. And, that gave him, kind of some control over not just air, the Air Corps, but he had to take into account everything else in the Army because he was G3 of the entire Army, not just the Air Corps. So, that was in a time when, we were building up to war. He was in charge of training and operations, which included, mobilization. So they were building up the forces. They had to get trained. He brought in the National Guard and reserves to, so that they could train with the regular Army, so that if and obviously when war came, we'd at least have our, feet on the ground starting to run.
And how do you think? You said he was obviously great friends with Marshall, but Marshall, he came up in the Casablanca conference show a couple of days ago. Marshall is. He can be humble. He was obviously a good leader, but he wasn't warm and cuddly. But that's an understatement. And if he took a dislike to people, it kind of didn't change. But he was loyal to people. So did Marshall write about Andrews and their or talk about their relationship or why he particularly liked him or could depend on him?
Basically, he said, it started with that tour, right? And that developed the personal relationship and the air education that Marshall received. And people talked about Marshall's little black book, right? Of people who he liked or thought could command. And that was one of the reasons for the maneuvers. And, if you showed your stuff and you proved competent, he trusted you. He would let you take the ball and run, and then he would rely on you. But he was also, like you said, pretty hard on people if you failed him. And, Andy, for all the talk and, Andy, was very similar in personality. And that was, and I'll get to the differences between he and Hap Arnold because people talked about a potential conflict there, a rivalry of sorts. And Andy was really easygoing, but he was also very loyal. And one of the things Marshall ends up telling Andy is, hey, you got to watch who's on your staff. Don't be so loyal to them. If they're not the right person for the job, you need to get rid of them. And, he's really referring to, a friend and colleague of Andy's, Jan Howard, who was very abrasive, but, an amazing engineer. So you need to, kind of put him in the back somewhere. He's definitely not a people person because, he was a jackass to most people. They have very similar personalities.
We've got a great question from Mad Cat about did General Andrews get his ideas from his own experience or other sources? Because, is he a sponge? Because you said he's meeting people from Italy and, around the world. Is he a sponge for other people's ideas? Or is he one of those people with his own very particular ideas that he's brought to himself, or a bit of both?
I think a bit of both. I think growing up, being around cavalry people, he had developed some of his own ideas. And then he, joins the Air Corps and he can kind of, take the ideas that he had gotten or grew up with and, how can these be, put out there in terms of air power or tanks. But then, through meeting Duhay and Billy Mitchell and Trenchard, they all had their own ideas. So I don't know that anybody necessarily is just an idea generator. You've got to take some of what everybody else is saying and then mold it into your own vision. And I think he was a bit of both.
That's a very good answer. And it's a hard balancing act if you're someone like that, is that you've got to be forthright. You've got to have a strong personality. You've got to be ambitious to rise up the ladder. You've got to be firm with your ideas, but you can't be too distant. You can't be obstinate. You can't be closed-minded to other people around you. You've got to have good people around you. And it's now, I think in the era we live now, we're better at understanding leadership. There, people go to university and understand and teach leadership, but I think maybe back in the day, it wasn't quite understood the qualities you need to be a good commander, a good leader, a good instigator of ideas. But
and anyway, that was, we talked about Hap Arnold and him. People talked about, there was this big rivalry between the two. They were friendly. Eventually they end up calling each other by their nicknames, Hap or Andy instead of Frank, right, and Henry. Or Pute, I guess, Arnold would be called. But it was more of kind of a friendship rivalry. They had very different personalities, very different leadership styles. I talked about Andy being kind of, have an idea and assign it to somebody and let them run with it. Arnold was more of a dictator type guy. He wanted his hands on everything. He was really good at, playing the Washington scene. He was really good at getting industries to follow what he wanted to do. He just wasn't that great of a people person.
I want to hear what you have to say about Hap Arnold and him, because Hap Arnold comes up every now on the channel, but not as often as perhaps he deserves. I know James M. Scott is a big not necessarily fan of Hap Arnold, but says we can't remove Hap Arnold from some of the biggest decisions being made in the American military in World War II. Although again, probably overshadowed by some other names later on, and people like Doolittle, who just became such a popular with the public person, and later on
he wasn't an operations guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? He was a behind the scenes management guy, build up guy. Get industry to make more planes, get industry to cooperate with the Army on training more pilots. How do I work with Congress? How do I, get the right ideas into Roosevelt's ear through Henry Stimson? That's where his strength lay, not in operations. And people, especially, when it comes to war, the heroes are the operators.
Yeah. No, definitely. No, I'm loving it, Kathy. I'm just hanging off every word. So just keep going. We're loving it.
So if we go back, people talk about, and I'm going to kind of go back to, Andy was a theater commander 3 times. First time theater commander of, by an airman, starts off in the Caribbean, and people now would go, well, the Caribbean was a nothing burger, right? The Caribbean wasn't that important. Well, what they don't think about is at the time, the Caribbean wasn't nothing. At the time he was in the Caribbean and commanded, the defense zone down there, the Caribbean was very important. You had the Japanese and the Germans, with espionage and, efforts down there, the idea of protecting the canal. And you had, the Germans talking about, if I drop 1 or 2 well-placed bombs in the Calibra Cut, it's going to stop all traffic going through the canal. And so it was a very, very important. You had U-boat activity down there. And so at the time, it was a very important command. And, Marshall sent him down there, go learn to work with the Navy. And he was, into unity of command. We need to have one commander in a region. And, when Pearl Harbor happened, the canal was not attacked. And everybody thought it would have been. But he had already had his forces on alert every day. They practiced realistic training. They were coordinating between, the anti-aircraft and gun and coastal artillery with the bomber, missions, pursuit aircraft, go out and learn to hit something when you shoot at it. So, it ends up being a big success. And that's when we talked about counter-espionage, and, the Japanese were constantly trying to get on the ships boarding through the canal just to kind of take a look at them. And, every time the Japanese minister would come in, for some reason, the canal was down. Sorry, we can't let you through. It's under repair. When, that wasn't the truth. We're just not letting you go. So, so he moves from there over to Cairo. And so, I have a picture of him in Cairo, with the British staff over there. And he's working with Conyngham and, setting up close air support. And, Marshall sends him over there, learn to work with the Brits. The Brits have the experience. We might have the equipment and the money, but the Brits have all the experience. So go learn to work with them, find out how they operate. And that's exactly what he did. He, consolidated the air forces over there, set up the structure like he had created the Caribbean, which ends up being the structure of the Air Force even today. And so, he's getting this education all the way around. And then that leads to, obviously the Casablanca conference, right? In January of 43, when Marshall personally sends for him because Winston Churchill, wants to, get rid of this daylight bombing thing, and everybody, join us with nighttime bombing. And, Hap Arnold sends for Acre, and Marshall sends for Andy, and they say, come, we want you to talk to Churchill for us. You're out there, you're seeing it. We need to convince him.
And it's good you mentioned that, because I always say that late 42, early 43 period was when the relationships between the US and the Great Britain, or the Great Britain and the Empire, were at their most strained. The planning for everything in the Mediterranean, everyone was disagreeing on what the future was, and the British still wanted to hold on the empire, and Americans are thinking empires are bad, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you need people then who can get on with people, who can see both sides. And as James Conroy said to us 2 days ago, they planned the Casablanca conference to, they'd hoped it'd be done and dusted in 2 or 3, 4 days. It was 10 days, and it started off quite quickly. And so at this point, although there's the people at the meeting, but there's all these peripheral figures around there as well that are involved in this. You need people who smooth waves, and it seems to me that's the kind of skill set he's bringing, as well as being a very good and knowledgeable person about, as you said, combined arms and how to do things.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The Americans felt snookered by the British, at the beginning of the conference. They're like, we got invited here and we just got our butts handed to us. We weren't prepared. We're going to have to go along now. And then this meeting, as you said, goes on longer and longer, and they take walks, and it's those side things, those, go have lunch with them. And even you read the notes from the meetings, and some of these notes just say, Churchill had lunch with Andrews.
Yeah.
Nobody took notes about what they discussed, or Churchill took a walk with Acre. Great. What did they talk about? Well, you can't say for sure, but when the meeting's over, at the end of that 10 days, what they talked about, right? Mm-hmm. You end up with the Casablanca Directive, which ends up becoming the, down the road, the combined bomber offensive. And, everybody's on better terms, I guess, after that. And, there's kind of a plan. Yeah, they were at odds. Do we invade the continent now, as originally planned, and they're like, no, we need to go through North Africa and Italy, screw the Russians right now. We need this. Mm-hmm. And, I think they're, at the end of that meeting, we're kind of getting back on track and working a bit more harmoniously.
Yeah, no, definitely. And of course, his story is connected with Eisenhower's story as well, because Eisenhower's route to eventually, heading up SHAEF and Operation Overlord was, took some left and right turns along the way. And one of the biggest things coming out of the conference was exactly what was going to happen to Eisenhower, which then directly affects Andy. So run us through the sequence of events.
Yeah. So Eisenhower was in London at the time. He was the commander of, I don't want to say, he was controlling things in London, and Andy was in Cairo. Yeah. And, none of them really had combat experience. No American really had no combat experience. So to say that, one person or the other was destined to lead the invasion, right, to be SHAEF, is just not true, right? Nobody was destined to be in that position. Nobody had combat experience. So, Andy had more experience on the political side, right? In Latin America and creating those treaties. He had the ground experience, the experience with the Navy, now the experience with the Brits. And, okay, we're going to put you up in London now, and we're going to put Eisenhower in charge of Torch, right? Because Torch had kind of already been planned. We're going to send him to North Africa. And that switch happens. And so now Andy moves up there in, February of 43, and Eisenhower goes down, and Andy starts, they want to increase the bombing, right? Which takes a bit of time. You don't have a lot of planes. They're not producing them quick enough. They're getting diverted to other theaters. You've got massive losses, with any of the bombing campaigns, because you don't have long range escorts. It's just sending crews after crews, and at times, 40% attrition, and you can't replace them, overnight. And you're catching all kinds of grief, back in America about, you're not doing your job. And, Hap Arnold is on Acre and Spots' butt, and Andy takes over, and we're like, oh, yay. But then, it still takes time. But, I think that was one of the reasons for the move, is, not just the political side, but also, we needed to kind of soften up the Germans with, some serious bombing. And Eisenhower didn't have that experience.
Yeah, I'm glad, we're going to tackle the air power as we move on with this discussion. But would you think that one of the results of the conference in Casablanca was moving forward in the war, having the diplomatic skills is going to be as important, if not more important, than the tactical command skills. In a sense, you can kind of learn how to maneuver people. You can, but natural leadership skills, you kind of either got them or you haven't. Is that a fair point?
I think so. I don't think you can learn the social skills needed, for good, solid leadership and political savviness, right? That's something that, like you said, you either have it or you don't. You can be a good tactical commander, right, without those skills, but you can't be a good strategic commander.
Yeah, and you can always, you can't people around you can't help you with your innate diplomatic skills. They're your own kind of personality. They can help you with how to wage war. There will always be advisors around you, people who know how to use air power, people who who've got ideas about close air support or whatever. But that ability to just hold court in a room and have people listen to you and them trust you, and you be able to kind of admonish them if you need to, staff can't help you with that.
Yeah, true. And he had it. He had the it factor when it came to that. Whether it was how he grew up, in Memphis, or being around those types of people his whole life, it just kind of came very natural for him. He would, there was a story about, him joking around with then, Princess Elizabeth, at Buckingham Palace, and about the parties, and, joking around when he's trying to find housing there with various people about their lives, and, them wanting to be, part of their dinners. And, he was just very, natural around people. And so they trusted him. They liked him. He was very easygoing. But he was, deep down inside, he was very competitive, very on point, on task. He knew he had a job. He knew how to get it done. But, externally, just a very easygoing kind of guy. And I think that, helped with who he became, who he was, how the Americans and the British, got along.
Yeah. So there we are. We're now early 1943. Eisenhower's got his Operation Torch path. Andrews has his path there. Take us through the next chapter.
So, the combined bombing offensive kind of gets going. Andy's right-hand guy, head of the 8th Air Force, is, Acre. And, at one point in time, Eisenhower wanted to exchange Doolittle for Acre. And Andy was like, no, nothing against Doolittle, but, the skill set that Acre has is not the skill set that Doolittle has. And Acre is who I need here. And, he let Acre kind of run with the CBO, but he developed the relationships, with Bomber Harris and with the British to set up these like Monday morning meetings kind of thing about what's our target selection? What does the intel look like? How can we work together better? How can we make this CBO with you doing the nighttime and us doing the daytime? How do we make it work? And, they finally, score a win, at Vegesack. And it's kind of like the first time that, we have this big success with daylight bombing. And, I think that kind of puts things kind of back on track that, okay, this is going to work. But he wasn't there very long before his death. Yeah. He was, he got there in February and he ends up getting killed on May 3rd.
Yeah, but I mean, we'll talk about the circumstances of that in a bit. But could you kind of condense what his vision for air power was? I mean, this is the era of competing air visions. Even within the individual countries, there's difference of opinions. Americans can't agree amongst themselves. The British can't agree amongst themselves. Add the Canadians and Poles, everybody else into it, trying to kind of adhere and move forward with a single policy. And it was still changing by 1945. But did he have in your investigation, kind of a single clear, this is what air power should be used for? Or was it kind of an ever evolving thing that changes as situations arise?
Well, it started out, you think about in the Depression or, things that happen. And when, you have a flood, and how one factory in the Northeast can shut down, running your airplanes, flying your airplanes, building your airplanes. And so when you take a single event where you can't get a spring or you can't get a bolt, right? And now you can't fly. So now you've shut down an entire industry or, in this particular instance, a branch of the Army. And so that, that kind of said, well, maybe these theories that, Clausewitz or Duhay or Billy Mitchell's talking about, maybe they really are true. And so that kind of leads to, we got to attack, our enemy, out to sea, or we have to attack the enemy's rear areas. Do we shut down a particular industry to cripple his air power? If we can control the air, then we control the ground. And so to control the air, you got to take out, keep them from building, keep them from getting off the ground, shutting off communication lines, railways, bridges, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where he saw air power's role. But then he, as war and things progress, he saw the need, where, the Army was constantly about, well, you just are there to support the infantry or whatever. He still saw the need for close air support and tactical air. So he saw how air power over time, again, this wasn't, initial, over time could be used in so many different ways. And then, so in each case, what is the best use of air power? Well, in this theater, it might be close air support. But, in Europe, it's probably strategic bombing, and attacking those factories and shipbuilding yards and oil refineries and that kind of thing. So it depended on, the battle, the war, the topography, and the best use of air power. So it did change over time, but it all started with how do we, have command of the air.
So you've dropped a few names in there. He's Acre, Churchill, Marshall. We know we've established that Marshall is firmly in his corner. As we get into 43, are there people he's not getting on with? I mean, Churchill
probably the biggest name that he doesn't get along with is MacArthur.
Well, no one gets on with MacArthur.
Well, but these are personal reasons he doesn't get on.
Right.
With
okay.
MacArthur.
Oh, do tell.
So the first kind of instance was in 35. So Andy, is at GHQ Air Force, and there's this testimony regarding the Wilcox bill and Representative McSwain. And he's talking about, we have this good neighbor policy, right, going on with Latin America. And Andy, in testimony that's supposed to be secret, says, if we have to, we don't want to, but if we have to, we might need to seize some islands or some land or some bases to protect the Western Hemisphere. whether it's in Canada or in Latin America. Well, that kind of upset some people. It really upset the Canadians. The testimony gets leaked. The president gets upset. The Canadian prime minister gets upset, and he has to formally apologize. And, everything is good until MacArthur hands him a letter of reprimand saying, I didn't know you were going to do this. Your testimony wasn't run by me. Well, it had been. But because it got leaked and everybody got their feelings hurt, because how dare we say that we might have to seize some bases, so that was kind of the beginning of it. Then you kind of, fast forward a little bit, and, MacArthur's out in the Pacific, and, he needs an air guy. And, Hap Arnold suggests to Marshall that, maybe Andy's a good fit. And, that's the time when Andy marches down to Hap Arnold's office and basically says, stay out of my business, kind of thing. And that's kind of one of the few times, he and Hap kind of butted heads. But then you fast forward to when MacArthur's in the Philippines and he retreats, and who gets put in charge? Skinny Wainwright takes his place, right? Guess who's Wainwright happened to be Andy's roommate at West Point and dear friend. So, Wainwright gets taken POW. So, there's another kind of, knife in the side of Andy. So he and MacArthur, did not get along. It was probably the biggest name if anybody knows, but you're right. MacArthur really didn't get along with anybody. MacArthur ends up getting Kenny as the air guy, and, works out perfectly. There's another one of Marshall's strengths is matching up personalities, right? So,
I think the people who went into this watching who don't know much about him, I think he's leapt up people's people they like just because the fact he doesn't like MacArthur. We don't have many MacArthur fans on this channel. The only one is our regular guest, James Zobel from the MacArthur Center, who is a big MacArthur fan because that's his job. But most people here, John McManus, they've not got many things to say, good things to say about
MacArthur. I would say most of the people I know are not MacArthur fans.
He's the only person who liked MacArthur was his own reflection in the mirror. I think that's the only person MacArthur really liked was looking back at himself. But we're going down a rabbit hole and talking about MacArthur. But what incredible insight into personalities, because that's that when you want to get to the heart of how decisions are made, it's understanding the mindset of the people making them. You can't understand the decision without understanding the person. So just to talk about the writing and research process, you obviously clearly had to know, not get to know Andrews, but all these other figures, Acre and Hap Arnold and others, because it's all the interdynamics that make a story, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and the Army was so small at that time, especially the officer corps, right? Everybody knew everybody, and everything was done at kitchen tables and playing poker or playing golf or whatever it was. And so that's kind of how they kind of got to know each other, was through those interactions. But yeah, as far as doing the research, it was a bit tough. His papers were with him on the plane, so they burned up. His official military records were in St. Louis at NAR, and that building burned. And guess who's, if letter A, A through L were all burned up in the fire. So how do you find information on him? So you start, basically with, what's his chronology? Where did he go? What did he do? And then looking in the papers of the people around him. What did they have to say about him? What were his jobs? And building from there. So you're taking pieces and parts from other people's stories.
Yeah, well, in many ways, you find out more about people from what other people say about them than you do from the person themselves, because generals can be sometimes quite vain. That's an understatement. Monty, I'm looking at you. And, you want to know what other people think of them. That's where you get the truth, isn't it? It's
it is. And we were talking about the relationship between he and Hap Arnold, and I drawn a blank on who said it, but the quote was, "People swore by Andrews and swore at Arnold."
Oh, that's a nice one. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Oh, I'm thoroughly enjoying this, but let's go back. As you said, there's only, alas, a few more weeks of his career ahead of him. So take us through those final few weeks and the tragic, and then we can sort of wrap up with some what ifs, I suppose.
Okay, so really, the majority of his time, which was very short-lived there in England, was ramping up those bombing campaigns and developing the relationships with the British for the combined bomber offensive and getting that solidified and kind of tweaking, the targets, right? Moving this one up and moving that one down and doing, touring, various bases and link trainers and making sure that the troops that were coming over were getting basically as live as possible training. He really valued, realistic training. So, they were, doing mock invasions and firing guns and flying airplanes and doing what they needed to do. And, that was, February to May. It's, not a very long time. And then that fateful day, May 3rd, when he gets on the plane.
Well, share those events with us. People who don't know what the outcome is. People are going, what happened to him? What happened to him? So
the official army version is he was going on an inspection tour of Iceland, because that's where, a lot of the men and equipment were being flown into and consolidated and then heading, to Britain. So officially that's where he was going, was this inspection tour. However, the plane that he was on, which becomes kind of a backstory, right? So it was a B-24D called Hot Stuff. It was the first heavy bomber to complete 25 combat missions. Okay, headed back to the US to do the war bond tour. Why get on that plane if he was only doing, a tour in Iceland when he could have gotten on any plane, because he was checked out in every plane and flew himself everywhere. So why get on that particular plane? 5 of their crew members were bumped for Andy and his staff. And, they were clear they were supposed to stop in Prestwick. So the normal route to get back to the States was to go to Prestwick, then on to Gander, and then the short hop to DC. And that was the route back and forth for every airplane. So they were supposed to stop in Prestwick, but they call in and they don't stop in Prestwick. They want to go to Iceland, right? He wants to stop and see the people in Iceland because he's big into, getting and talking to the people on the ground and, doing the kumbaya and that kind of thing. He was a people person. It wasn't just among the officer corps. And the pilot is flying, Robert Shannon. Andy is sitting in the co-pilot's seat. Okay. And, there was questions initially, well, was he flying? Because he would want to fly because he thought of himself as the best instrument flyer. And the weather was good initially. And then all of a sudden a snowstorm hits and they try to land at Caldedarns and no visibility. So they circle and they go and try to land at Meeks. Same thing. They drop flares. They can't see the runway and they're going to go back and try again at Caldedarns. And they turn and are going to follow the coastline. And, he's like, how much clearance do I need? Oh, you only need 40 feet. And lo and behold, they crash into this mountainside, 1,100-foot mountain. It's barely a hill, right? And the plane, explodes. Everybody is killed except the tail gunner, Sergeant Isel, which is in a way, and I'll get back to Andy in a second, kind of a funny story about Isel because here he is in the tail. The plane is broken up, scattered all over the mountainside, and he's pinned, by the gun. Hard enough to keep him pinned, but not hard enough for him to lose his legs. The plane is on fire, it's snowing, and he's like, well, I'm just going to die. I'm going to get burned up. So whatever he can reach, grabs some blankets, pulls them over him, and he's just prepared for death. Well, lo and behold, the snow puts out the fire. People are aware that this plane has gone down, and they send out a search party. And the search party, gets to the crash site and hears him and rescues him. And of course, the first thing he says isn't, hey, how's it going? Thanks for saving me, is, do you have a cigarette? So, obviously the plane crashed, everybody's dead, Andy, his entire staff, Bishop Leonard, the crew, except for 5 people of Hot Stuff, all perish on that day. Very upsetting to the world. The people in Britain that he worked with, the Icelandic people, which he'd only known for 3 months, and now everything there is named after him. The theater, the recreation center, the field house, they've got a big the monument to him. People in Latin America are having services for him. Bases are getting named for him. American Legion offices are getting named for him. So he obviously had a very big influence on people. They keep it secret, for as long as they can. Marshall, this is why the title is Marshall's Great Captain. In his eulogy, he says the Army only ever produces a few great captains, and Andrews is undoubtedly one of them. And, this is where the speculation, then comes in is, the rumor has it he had been called back to the States by Marshall. And, at Andy's funeral, Marshall is there and he makes a comment to his family members about, I was bringing him back for a big job, which then leads into what's that job? Was he destined to be, Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, SHAEF, or was there something else? And, so, luckily the publisher let me play a what if game, with the last chapter. And I thought it was very important to be able to do that because of the speculation. And, so what I did is to go out there and say, what were the available jobs that existed at that time? And who or what, who really called him back? Was it Marshall? Was it Arnold? Well, it couldn't have been Arnold. He didn't work for Arnold. And Arnold was only in charge of air, and Andy would never have gone to just an air job. He'd been a theater commander. So whatever the job was had to have been, a combined arms type job, a theater type job, or, could have been Marshall's deputy, could have been to replace Hap Arnold. But, most of the evidence, and it really comes from a footnote in Forrest Pogue's biography of Marshall, where he point blank, and you have to take into consideration the time that Pogue wrote Marshall's biography, Eisenhower was president, right? So the last thing you want to say is, oh, by the way, you were my second choice, right? You're not going to come out and say that about a current president, a war hero. So Forrest Pogue point blank asks Marshall, was he going to be Supreme Allied Commander in Europe? And Marshall gives kind of a coded response. And he says, I sent him to the Caribbean to work with the Navy. And I sent him to Cairo to learn to work with the Brits. He's the only one I had a chance to train all around. So is that confirmation? It's probably the closest thing to a smoking gun.
Kind of convinced me, Kathy. I have to say, you've convinced me.
So I don't come out, even in the book, I don't come out and say, yes, that was the job, but it is the most likely job.
I think we all have to forget what we know about Eisenhower, in the sense that it seems so impossible that Eisenhower wouldn't have been, doing what he was doing from 44 onwards. And yet you said it yourself earlier. I mean, colonel to 5-star general in how many years it was, not very many. And as you said, Torch gave him some experience, but he didn't have anything like the all-round experience. You started this by saying, cavalry, air power, sea power, communication, signals. He's got a huge array of talents and has clearly the same diplomatic skills that we know Eisenhower had. So, it's really the counterfactuals can only ever be a counterfactual, and the what ifs can only ever really be in a sense a pub conversation, but they're really fascinating pub conversations.
Yeah, the dissidents will say, well, it was the air guys saying that about Andy. Well, of course they're going to say that. Of course they're going to say Andy was destined to lead. He was an airman. He's one of us. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple other jobs that he may have been could have been moved to the Mediterranean and North Africa, maybe. it ends up going to a Brit. You know, it wasn't destined. It could have been. Not a lot of evidence to say one way or the other. Could have come home to replace McNarney as Marshall's deputy, maybe. There's talk maybe he would have been replacing Hap, because by then Hap had his first heart attack. Right? And then he goes on to have more.
He was going to be going forwards in his career, not backwards, wasn't it? I mean, they weren't going to send him back to shovel shit in Alabama. His stock had risen. He demonstrated ability. He was going to get something worthy of that respect he'd earned. And Ian Carr, regular viewer, said there, the fact all his staff were with him suggests a change of role as well. You know, it wasn't like he was nipping back to do some shopping for a birthday or something. You know, his staff is there as well. So, yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. There's a final question for you is, if the skills did he obviously didn't get the chance to really show off his talent because he died when he did, but whatever job he'd been into, I'm assuming you think that he would be someone we will be talking about 80 years later. Wherever he had gone, certainly he would have been good at it.
There were people talking, you know, Eisenhower goes on to become president. Why wouldn't Andy have gone on to become president? If he would have been Supreme Allied Commander, he had those social skills. He was a politician. He could shake hands and kiss babies with the best of them. You know, would he have gone on to be, you know, president? So there's lots of, you know, what ifs. You know, he was, you know, that kind of guy, right?
Someone just said, or would it have allowed Marshall to go and do Overlord? Because, you know, we kind of
Marshall
know that
wanted it. Marshall wanted
it
bad, right? He but he also knew, and I put a quote in there in the book where, you know, Roosevelt says, I wouldn't be able to sleep. You know, Marshall goes, you know, he wants it bad. But he's going to do whatever Roosevelt wants. And Roosevelt tells him, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if you weren't in Washington. So when
Marshall
Roosevelt
made
tells
himself
him
indispensable, hasn't he? Marshall there's a kind of connection. It's similar to kind of Brooke in
Bridget. At that point in time, Marshall knows he's not going to get it based on Roosevelt saying, I can't sleep at night knowing you weren't here with me.
Yeah. And Mad Cat saying Roosevelt would never allow Marshall to go. And I think I agree. You know, it's
and Marshall would have respected Roosevelt's wishes, and he would not have pushed harder for it. Once Roosevelt makes that comment, Marshall is not going to push.
Well,
and he was a master at putting people together.
This has been a really, really, really brilliant show. I've really enjoyed this one, Kathy. I'm going to have to throw another question now saying, who are you going to investigate next? Because I feel your talents you need to go and do this with someone else, and really get into the weeds of the interpersonal relationships and stuff. Because I think there's so many books on all these big figures, but are people really necessarily saying anything new these days? And I feel you've brought some real good new stuff to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a couple of projects in the works, and one is centered around airmen who've kind of run afoul of leadership and why and what ends up happening to them. And obviously Andrews is one of them, getting banished you know, to the same place Billy Mitchell goes, but then he goes on to have a great career. Hap Arnold, you know, he gets banished very early in his career for speaking out. He goes, you know, off to Fort Riley. You know, Andy's staff at GHQ gets scattered to the four winds, you know, by Westover, and they all come back to do great things in World War II. So, you know, and then there's some other people I want to do some investigating on, and then there's some other, you know, air power things that I want to write about.
Oh, we love the idea of air power things. I have to put you in touch with Luke Truxell. He's my resident kind of air power guy, and he's doing some amazing work.
I love it.
And we got a quick question from Ian again. Did Roosevelt know Andrews? Had they had any interaction?
They had some. They weren't close. They mostly worked through people like Henry Stimson and Louis Johnson, the advisors to Roosevelt. You know, they had met, but they weren't close. You know, Arnold was closer to Hopkins and Roosevelt than Andy was. Andy was closer to, you know, Arnold had that relationship with Hopkins, kind of like Andy had with Marshall. So they knew each other, but they weren't close.
So I'm going to throw one question at you, and we're going into the real depths of what ifs now, because June 44, the anniversary is coming up very soon, and there'll be the same questions coming out. And one of the ones that's always debated is Eisenhower's broad front strategy as you go on through Europe. I mean, it's very hard to say. I'm putting you on a spot there, but let's say Andrews does head up Overlord, and Andrews is in charge of everything. Would broad front have gone along with what you think about the man, or would he have been more sort of incisive, bolder? What's your gut feeling?
Oh man, there's a tough one.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's the tough one. You think about it, right? Would the conduct of the war have gone the same way?
Yeah.
Who would have been the odd man out? Bradley,
yeah.
Eisenhower, Patton. Who becomes the odd man out based on what we know about the war, right? No, I want to say there still probably would have been a broad front. That's just a gut thing. I don't have any evidence of it, but my gut says so, just because of the way he operated in the Caribbean. As far as, having it, separated into 3 sectors and treating each differently, and how things were to be run and operated, all for the common goal of protecting the zone.
Well, I've just decided, I've written it down. I'm inviting you back for my next. In fact, I haven't got a next air power panel planned, but I'm now going to plan one. I'm going to bring you, and I'm going to bring Luke, and I might bring Mike Bechtold on from Canada, and we'll thrash out something about air power, because I feel it would be really cool. And I could just sit and watch these superstars of history, because you are a superstar. I really, this has been fantastic. I do a lot of these, and this has been really good. So, folks, we're back again in a few hours' time. We have a look at the 1st Division training and ahead of D-Day. That will accompany the show we did with Joe Balkowski last night about the 29th Division. Then I've got a break over the weekend, but I will see you in a few hours' time. Don't forget, folks, you've got to go out there and get Kathy's books. The link's in the description below, or buy it at your favorite book. Oh, Kathy's going to hold up a copy. There we go. Marshall's Great Captain. Fantastic there. Go and get it. Make her feel good. Few dollars in the royalty kitty never does anybody harm. So it's been a fantastic talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you, guys. I've enjoyed this.
Bye.